Welcome to episode 36 of the Hunt Backcountry podcast presented by Exo Mountain Gear. Right up front, a very, very, very important announcement, something super exciting for all of you guys, and that's a big Exo Mountain Gear giveaway. So we just recently broke 10,000 followers on our Hunt Backcountry Instagram page. Thought it would be cool to celebrate, and we also have some new Exo products getting ready to hit the market. So let's combine those two. Let's celebrate by giving away this new pack system. Now, what is the new pack system? Well, it's the day pack. We've talked about it, we've mentioned it, and there's a few other things that we haven't mentioned yet that will be coming along with it. So super exciting stuff. We will have a show on the podcast just about all of these new items, so you'll be hearing more about that. But the giveaway. So it's a pack system. You're definitely going to want to check it out. How you enter is super easy. Go to exomountaingear.com/giveaway. /giveaway. That's it. All you need to do is enter your email address. It's just for our newsletter. We're not going to share that information. It's not going to anybody else. We won't send you a bunch of junk. What you will get is updates on new products. We will ask you for feedback on hunting packs, maybe in the future. It's something we've done in the past, and specifically we've made design changes based on that user feedback. So it's pretty cool to participate in that process, I think. And of course, you'll get the first and best chance at not only the latest products, but the latest deals in terms of specials going forward. So exomountaingear.com/giveaway. There's a little widget there. You enter the email address. It's really straightforward. But just for you guys, just for the podcast listeners, we also have a bonus method of entry. So because you're listening to this show right now, you can get your name in the hat twice. So one for your email address, a second for this bonus keyword. The bonus keyword for this show is access, the word access. So it's something we've kept in mind for sure with the day pack. You'll see it, you'll hear more about it in terms of features and access with the day pack. For example, a new stretch spotting scope pocket makes it super easy to store your optics, super quick to deploy them, and then equally as quick to get them put away, make a move. So we know that especially with day hunters, you need to keep gear organized, easy to access, and ready to hunt and hunt hard. So bonus keyword, access. Okay, that was a super long intro, but hopefully worth it considering you now have a chance to win an awesome pack. In this week's show, which is super exciting, we have Paul Medel. You might know him as the Elk Nut. He has spent literally decades hunting elk, studying elk, observing elk, and kind of documenting all of the above. So Paul has his own theories on calling that are extremely interesting. His focus is not just on making noises, but really speaking in elk language, if you will. So in this episode, we dive into elk calling, learn all kinds of tips, cover some topics that you might never heard of, such as a cow elk bugling, or maybe a bull elk making cow vocalizations. Interesting, right? So it's an awesome show. We love Paul. We love hearing his passion for elk hunting. Hope you enjoy it. If you are enjoying the show, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever else you're listening to it. Also, if you ever have comments, questions, feedback, any of the above, go ahead and email us, podcast@exomountaingear.com. Specifically, we're probably going to have Paul on another show down the road. And it would be great to get some of your specific questions that you want to hear answered from Paul. So go ahead and email those elk calling questions to podcast@exomountaingear.com. Finally, last thing, promise, we are going to break this up into two parts. I had a good long conversation with Paul, so be sure to tune back in for episode 37, part 2 with Paul, and it's the second bonus keyword for the giveaway. So you, the podcast listeners, have 3 chances to win. Nobody else does, so you should feel pretty dang special. All right, finally, enough ranting, enough of me. On to the show with Paul. So Paul, for those of you, I'm sure most of our listeners are probably familiar with your work and familiar with you, but for those of you that aren't familiar with the elk net, please give us a bit of background about your elk hunting history and really just your passion to understand these animals, if you could.
Yeah, no problem. And Mark and Lenny, I appreciate you guys allowing me to share information and be part of the discussion. That excites me as a hunter, that there's individuals out there that can appreciate the value of trying to understand elk and then using it effectively as a hunter. So, no, I appreciate it very, very much. So thank you, guys. But as far as Elk Net Outdoors, we've been around now for, I believe this is our 17th year. And basically, it came from the very words that you use, and that's the passion that we have for elk hunting. And we just knew years ago, I've been doing this for 33, 34 years as far as trying to understand elk sounds. And I could tell from the very beginning that there was something about it. And one thing led to another, to where I started trying to understand the sounds by being out in the woods at the end of June, all of July and August, before hunting season started, years and years ago, trying to understand. And of course, it was such a trial and error thing. It's not like I was going to college or anything like that, you know. And so it was kind of a boots on the ground, break down what I'm hearing. And repetitious was so important, because, yeah, you could hear a sound or a scenario, but you needed to have everything happen repetition-wise so that you could say, okay, this now fits. And one thing led to another. Then people started seeing how many elk we were killing, because we live in an area here in Idaho that the success rate was 5.9%, and it still is today. And they could see we were killing elk every single year. And so they started asking us, what are you guys doing? Because, you know, we hunt over the counter, do it yourself. And I started sharing with them how we were using the elk sounds and how we understood that the elk were sending a message with every sound they made. And, of course, one thing led to another, and we evolved that into our hunting style. And, of course, we even learned more during the hunting seasons, because the sounds can change a little bit more. And that means the sounds change with intensity or cadence that you don't really get from November all the way up until August. It's just communication at that time. And things change dramatically, you know, once you start hitting the rutting times for any animal. But this one here, we're talking about elk. And I can see the value in trying to understand the sounds and look at the success we've had today. I mean, it's been incredible, and it's all through understanding the sounds that elk make. You know, we still learn today. It's not like we know everything, but it all evolved somewhere right around, you know, from that standpoint. And then Elk Net Outdoors came together about 17 years ago, when individuals started asking us to put some information down that we could share with others. And that's how it kind of took off, and now it does real well.
Yeah, that's cool. So going back, I mean, something you mentioned is so important. You know, if hunters are in the woods in June, July, August, before the season opens after elk, they're scouting, they're looking for elk, but they're not doing what you were doing in the beginning, and that's just kind of being present and trying to understand maybe their vocalizations and their behavior. Since you weren't hunting and you weren't, you know, playing call and response, how were you trying to understand elk vocalizations at that time of year, just by seeing how other elk responded around them and seeing what those patterns were?
Well, certainly that's part of it. But, you know, a lot of times you didn't really go out there with a game plan. You just allowed things to develop. And I knew where these elk like to winter, and so you couldn't do anything about it. They were way too far away, so you had to wait for them to come back. Once they got into these areas, to their summer range, so to speak, and they're not near the roads, I had to walk, I would say 2 to 3 different miles, you know, to find these elk. And I would stay with these elk until maybe midnight to 1 a.m, and then come out with a flashlight. And I would do this by myself. It intrigued me so much. And I would get home, and of course my wife was like, "What are you doing?" And well, I'm not kidding you. And after about a year or two, my wife said, "You know what? You're an elk nut." And that's where the name came from. Seriously, that's how it came. And it stuck with me ever since. But listening to these elk, I learned so much outside of the hunting seasons. And like I say, once you're there, it was like you learned one thing and then another. And then you had questions within yourself about this and this and this. And I'll tell you, one of the first things I learned was how these elk knew each other by their sound. It was the first thing I learned, I think, seriously. I would sit there and watch 60 or 70 elk. And they had no idea I was there, had no clue. And I could be within, maybe 125 yards and watch them. I was watching cows bugling. I'd never heard cows bugle or even heard anybody talk about it. And then you see a couple of satellites and they'd scream and groan, but I'd watch these cows bugle. And so I'd sit there and listen to these elk. I mean, the sounds were just everywhere, off the charts, from calves to cows. And I decided one day after listening to them, and they didn't pay any attention to one another, I decided I was going to see if I could call anything. And I thought, I'm going to make a couple cow sounds and see. And when I did that, it showed me something. Because when I made a cow sound, you think that nothing would have paid one bit of attention to me. Nothing. But almost every head stopped and turned and looked in my direction because they didn't recognize who I was. And I noticed it right off the bat. It was like, whoa. I mean, how do they know, one another that close or recognize the sound that when they heard a distant one or one they had not, they're not familiar with, it immediately got their attention. And I learned something from that. And of course, it kind of snowballs after that into a lot of sounds. But that one thing, I still use that today and try to share that with others, because a lot of folks will say, they've cow called and they've done this and the elk wouldn't come. And it's because they don't realize how close-knit a family the elk are when they're in a bunch that they're familiar with one another. They really look at you as someone else. They're that smart. And anyway, that was something that always intrigued me, that very first thing that years and years ago, 30-something years ago, but it stuck with me.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's really interesting. So let's, one thing that's about the show, there's so much information, Paul. I love hearing your passion. We have a ton of questions. We'll see what we get to. And some of those questions, we kind of asked our followers on Instagram, hey, we're going to be talking with Paul. What do you want to know? And I want to go ahead and get into one of those right away. And it makes sense chronologically. We just talked about you being out there preseason, but let's talk about early season, the first week or two of the season. Sometimes, that's late August or maybe the first week of September. What do you do then when bulls seem a bit call shy, don't seem talkative, don't seem quite, fired up and seeking cows yet? So what's your strategy then for that, say, first week of season?
Well, for one, I wouldn't say they were call shy from when the hunting season just starts. It's more like pre-rut stage. For bulls to bugle and to get competitive, you have to have a hot cow. Outside of no hot cows in an area, your bugling can be very lazy and laid back. You may hear one or two in the morning, and that's it. Nothing else. Zero. All day, no matter how hard you tried. And it's because there's no cows in heat and the bulls aren't that fired up yet. So that's really what's going on. It isn't that so many people have called them within 1 or 2 days that they shut down, which would really be a call shy bull if you're hunting, near trails or right off of roads and stuff of that nature. But it depends on the bull or the elk you're looking for. See, we're target specific these days. If I'm looking for any elk, then I go straight to blind or cold calling setups. That's what I do. Now, blind and cold calling setups refers to a lot of cow chatter, cow-calf chatter, and some folks will introduce a small bull bugle, and you can even do a cow bugle at that time if you wanted, and it sounds like a spike. And the reason those things can work is because a lot of times they're still cow groups with no bulls in them when you're looking at August 30th, 31st, September 1st, 2nd. In some areas, there are bulls with them already, and most of them are, smaller bulls. But these cows will bugle amongst that group, and when she bugles, she's saying the same thing a bull does. You see, bulls and cows can make the identical sound. A bull can bugle, he can scream, he can grunt, give a nervous grunt. He cow calls all the time, nothing unusual. Well, cows do the same thing. They give the same grunt, they can chuckle, they can give a nervous grunt, they do it all. And so a lot of people don't realize that. So when a cow is doing that, she's still saying the same thing a bull is. Just like if you and your wife were talking or scolded one of your children, does it come out differently because she said it instead of you? No, you're still saying the same thing. Well, cows do this. This is an important thing for blind cold calling setups. You can actually mimic a younger cow keeping track of her group. And so if that's what you're up to, you're going to call more cows and spikes in than anything. and maybe an occasional raghorn. But that's what you would do, and it's called trolling for elk. You would try to use these setups, call for, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Some people a little more, a little less, really doesn't matter. You kind of wind it up, wind it down. Start it up again in a couple minutes, do it all over again, and then sit and wait 30, 40 minutes. That's what you would do, especially if you feel elk are within earshot, because this can pull elk towards you, from a mile away. It can pull them a long ways. And the importance.
And at that point,
go ahead.
At that point, are you trying to make chatter and sound like multiple elk?
Yes, because elk are herd animals, and so this can intrigue other elk to come and check you out, wanting to know who you are in that area. Okay. So I don't, if you want to ask a question there, we can do that, but I didn't want to just keep on going and rattle, take all your time there.
No, I was just wondering when you were talking about, these setups and calling for 4 or 5 minutes, you're not just sitting there banging one call, making one sound, trying to sound like one elk, but you're trying to kind of mimic maybe multiple cows or
a small group.
Yeah, a small group. And
just like they would do. You're doing the same thing, that the elk activity that you're presenting is something that elk would do at that time of the year, okay? And that's all you're really doing. You're keeping track of one another. You're rustling the brush. You're kicking. You're hoofing around a little. If there's 2 or 3 hunters, it's really good to separate. You can get, if it's my son and I, we'll get 30, 40 yards apart, and we'll go ahead and mimic that. If there's 3 of us, we may get in a triangle, and you get a hunter in each point. Okay, if there's 4 of you, you can go in a rectangle, hunter in each point, and you're calling back and forth, chattering up a storm. And if you get an elk to start coming in, and sometimes you do, you'll hear them. They don't hardly ever call. They just start coming, or you can hear them popping things, or you see a movement. Well, the hunter that sees him stops calling. He calls no more. That shows the other 3 on point, or 2 on point, or whatever it is, that person has something coming. So you keep up the calling going to continue to attract that elk to keep coming forward. You see, and so, there's just little things you can do, but again, you're usually calling in the smaller bulls and targeting the cows, spikes, calves, and that's what's going to show up. Very rarely will you ever call in a big mature bull. Can it happen? Heck, anything can happen, but I'll tell you something. In the early years when we started doing this, I bet you we've done this setup well over 100 times, well over. I have to date never called in a 6-point bull, not one time, never. And I've called in a lot of spikes, hundreds and hundreds of elk, but never a mature bull to that setup. Now, I've heard people say they have, but that just shows you that it's a real low odds calling sequence to bring in a mature bull with it. It would be luck of the draw, for that to happen. But if you're after any elk, it can be good. And to make a lot of chatter there is important, because what you have to appreciate is you're trying to bring elk to a spot to check you out that they have no intention of going to. None. That's not a destination spot. So you have to remember those things. You have to really play on their curiosity. And a lot of times we'll inject a contact buzz that asks other elk to come over. Go ahead.
So speaking of that, where you're setting up, I mean, it seemed like, early when I first started calling elk, I'd set up where I could see everything. Can you kind of talk about, with this calling sequence, what are you looking for when you're setting up? How's the terrain, cover? Because it seems to me over the years, I think I found out that's almost as important, especially if you want to kill elk and not just see them.
That's the number 2 thing. And even in the DVDs, I speak about that, because your setup is so close secondary to good calling. And that, I believe that's why we have never used a decoy to call in elk. And the reason for that is we make sure that when we have a setup, and I'm talking blind cold calling setup, breeding sequence, advertising, working a herd bull. See, all those are different things. Those are different strategies for different elk. Your setup is so important that if you allow elk to get to the point where they're 100 yards away or 80 or well out of your bow range, we'll say, that's where they stop. And they hang up right there, because they know they've gotten to a spot. Elk are smart. They only need to hear you one time. They got you pegged within 5 feet. And this is no kidding. Half a mile away, they got you pegged within 5 feet. So what's important, and we learned this the hard way like everybody else, is your setup has to be in the tightest quarters, or just on the other side of a bank or draw or over a knoll, or anything like that hides your presence. So it continues to keep them coming in search mode. And by doing that, you will have elk keep coming until they get to the spot where they can actually see where the source of the calling is coming from, which is really good if you're a solo hunter. If you're a tag team, it works both ways. And I can tell you that my son and I, in the 25 years my son started bow hunting, we have called over 1,000 bulls to bow range, all on over-the-counter public land hunts. So that setup, like Lenny just brought up, is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, you will get those elk to hang up. And then they run online and they start chattering about how their calling is this and the elk are call shy, and they keep stopping way out there. And it's really their setup more than any other thing. They're giving the elk the luxury to stop out there and look where that sound's coming from and see what? Nothing. And even a decoy cannot be a good thing at that time because you're imitating 4 or 5 elk sometimes. And they want to see it. They want to see that commotion, especially on over-the-counter hunts, where these elk have been hunted so many times.
Yeah, I think that's one thing. I mean, going into setups, it always, as the hunter, we think, oh, if I can see 80, 100 yards, that's perfect because it gives me a chance to see them coming, right? Like that makes... Yeah,
it's human nature.
It's human nature. But as you're saying, that's like
yes,
maybe the worst thing you can do. I mean, it feels so horrible to think, oh man, I only have a 20, 30-yard window here. They're going to be right on me before I know it. But, if they can't see until they get within that window, it's going to bring them in, as you just mentioned.
Well, what happens is you have to have it happen once or twice. Then you start gaining the confidence that, oh, be darned, they do come in like that. But, you have that fear that you're missing out on a lot that maybe not even show up. But you'll overcome that fear real easy once you start seeing those things come right to your door. And they come in so quiet. But they do come in. And I will tell you this, most cases than not, by a mile, they come straight in. Very rare do my son or I, when we're calling, whether we're together or alone, ever have an elk coming downwind. It is so rare. I would say 95% of the elk come straight at the sounds. They don't try to hook around. And what I have found that the reason they hook around in most cases is they have cause for suspicion. There's something there. Maybe they saw your movement or it's too open or your calling doesn't even fit the scenario or you sound terrible. There's something that causes suspicion on the elk, and that is what creates that downwind, checking you out, making sure that you're not a possible threat.
Yeah. Let me ask you a quick question, Paul, on that. Say you do have a narrow window, say like a 30-yard, 35-yard lane, and the elk gets past that. What's your reaction at that point? If an elk gets through your lane, past where you had your shot opportunity, and now it is headed towards a direction where it will be downwind, what do you do, if anything, at that point?
We don't let that happen, and I mean that seriously. You can't let that happen. So when you have a setup, you're monitoring that wind 100% of the time. That wind checker is in your hand. Okay, so when you're calling elk, and they're coming, or you could hear them whether they're vocalizing or not. Just like you said, it's coming and it goes through the window. Is with our wind checker, we know exactly where the elk can get to before we're busted. So we know we have to kill them before they get to that point. And if it's an elk we're interested in, that's what we're going to do. If we don't want that elk, we let it go on through. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop that elk. We're prepared all the time. I mean, within reason. I mean, we just are prepared for every little thing that can happen out there. So we will actually stop that elk as it comes through that window. And we're pretty good at it.
Stop them.
What's that?
What's the best way to get them to stop?
Nervous grunt, 100%. And the reason is, will a cow call stop an elk? Sure, it'll stop an elk. But when you're hunting a lot of timber and thick country and you're really hunting areas like you said, you have a real small area or a small window, 8 inches, 12 inches, 3 feet, whatever it is. As soon as that elk hits that window, you stop them. And the reason I use the popping or nervous grunt, as I call it, is because it asks an action out of them. Okay, a cow sound doesn't ask an action out of an elk. It just says there's an elk there. Like if you heard somebody talking in the woods, crap, there's a guy over there. But what if you heard a guy going, can somebody help me? I've fallen. I'm hurt over here. Can someone help me? I mean, that gets your attention in a way. There's an action required by you. Well, the nervous grunt, When a bull or cow or calf gives that sound, it means it's seen or saw something and is now asking for a visual or identification. And so that's what happens a lot of times if you have an elk. I'm sure you and Lenny both have been in the woods and 80, 90 yards away, an elk comes in to where it knows it should see something, and it gives you that nervous grunt sound. And it gives you it's a one note sound, and it's asking for an identification. It wants to see you. So that's the sound I give to stop that elk in that window. And let me tell you what, when you give that sound, you better be ready, because you can stop them from 5 yards away or 150 yards away. They understand what that sound means to them. It means something saw them, or they need an identification or a visual to make sure that everything's okay. They're not a possible threat to them or to the herd. And I mean, it anchors them. Whereas a cow sound, I've had elk take 2, 3, 4 more steps or not even hear me, because it's a low volume thing. And it just, sometimes it doesn't get out there enough. And so ever since I went to the nervous grunt, I would say that between my son and I and elk that we've killed and called in for others, we've probably taken maybe 50, 60 elk that just with the nervous grunt alone is what saved the day right there, with no cow sounds.
So when you say nervous grunt, is that kind of the woof?
Yeah. You want me to give it?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
I'll turn away from the computer and give it so it's not so... so it won't be too loud. Okay, here's what it would sound like with no bugle, just a reed in my mouth, and that's what I usually will do it. That's what I do right there.
I hate that sound.
Well, see, first of all, don't associate that with a bark. Okay, there's a bark and then there's a nervous grunt, and so there's a difference between them. A nervous grunt is asking an action. Again, it's a visual or an identification of what it is that has alarmed them. They're nervous over the action. Now, if you hear a bark is a more shrill, and it's done in repetition. And that's a mountainside clearing event. You're not stopping that elk. Once they know they've winded you or made a concrete visual, they are out of there. And they'll alert the other elk. And so you'll hear them give that bark, which is real similar to that nervous grunt, over and over, and other elk can actually start chiming into it as they vacate the area. So see, there's a big difference between a nervous grunt and a bark, or an alarm bark. And you'll notice elk, have you ever had them do that to you? And then maybe they'll give it again in 20 seconds and they haven't moved. 20, 30 more seconds go by, they do it again. And you can keep them there for minutes because they're not sure what they saw. They saw a movement or something that they need an identification. And of course, they'll only stay so long. Now, there's ways to kill that elk. We've killed quite a few of them that gave us that nervous grunt first, but we try to beat them at it. If we have a bull coming in and we're calling one and he comes and he hangs up and I see him standing in the brush at 30, 40 yards, but he hasn't made a sound, I'll hit him with that sound real quick. I'll hit him with that. Just like that, and you would be shocked how many times they step out to look at you because they think you're an elk. You've asked them to show themselves, and they come out just enough to look at you. Where's the elk out that I just missed? They're toast. That's it. They're done. You can cow call all you want, but it doesn't ask them anything. It doesn't mean they won't step out, but your odds are really low. Where it raises your odds up. I would say easy 75 to 80% that you're going to get a movement or an action out of them and give you that shot in that little bit of a window or that crease, whatever it takes to get it done. If they don't, let them walk away. That's it. Just let them go. They still don't know what you are. Let them be. And they're not running out of the country.
I really wish I would have asked you that question before last year when this exact problem happened to me. And I cow called and it just kept going for 4 more steps and then kind of wandered around.
That's what happens.
Yep.
And you can do that sound with your voice too. So practice that. And a reed in the mouth, really helps. But you can also kind of just give just like that. And I stopped a ton of elk with just giving that kind of a sound. You see, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to represent the sound that makes sense to them, that actually can happen at that encounter. Because, you don't know if an elk's a 1.5-year-old or a cow or calf or 3.5-year-old bull or 6.5 or 5.5-year-old cow. They all have a different voice. So as long as your sound is somewhere within that range, it'll just stop them in their tracks.
And that's clearly, not being an expert caller by any means myself. That's even for, I think, beginners or newcomers to elk calling. You can hear a clear difference in that vocalization versus a standard cow call and things like that.
Oh yeah.
Hopefully you guys listening, that makes a ton of sense to you. Can we back up, Paul? And I'm sure that guys have heard this and have probably been wondering about this question for the last 10 minutes as we've talked about other things. But, you mentioned earlier about cows bugling, and I'm sure that's such a foreign concept to so many people, and just not something that they have heard of or even thought of happening. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of, a cow making a bugling vocalization and what that might mean and how they might use that within herd dynamics?
Well, it's the same as a bull. When a bull has cows, let's say he has cows, then that's when cows are usually bugling. See, cows have their own little groups in the summertime. If you go out there, you may see groups in our area, maybe 70, 80 groups of elk. But if you look closely and pay attention and sit there like I have for hours, you'll notice there's like little groups of maybe 3, 4, maybe 8, maybe 11, whatever it is. And there's a lead cow for each one of those groups. It's not like they're all just one big family. It appears to be that way at first. But until you sit there and watch this carefully and scrutinize, you'll start seeing there's little groups. So just like a bull will keep his cows together, if they start getting separated or they do get separated from a predator or a human, he has a locator sound that lets the group know where he is, just like a gobbler. He gets his hens separated. He will make a sound that calls and gives a direction to those hens to regather. A bull does the same thing. Well, that's what a cow is doing. She's keeping her little group, not the whole 80 herd out there, just her little tight-knit group. And that's who she's talking to. And so if they start getting too far or she hears the sound of a calf way out there, she will bugle like that, just like a bull will, to keep the group together. And that's all she's really doing. That's the dynamics of it. So, you don't want to make it bigger than it really is. It's just a communication and keeping track of one another. That's it. Simple. But it's very effective if you're going to do it on a blind cold calling sequence, because when you have a cow bugle, you're going to hear a sound like this here. That's about all she'll do. She doesn't go through 3 notes. She doesn't get hoarse and raspy or growling. You hardly ever hear her do that. You notice it's kind of more like spiky squeal, really immature. And even a 9-year-old cow will sound exactly like that. They have a real low volume. And a lot of guys, you'll hear them in July. They'll come online and go, I heard bulls bugling everywhere. What's a cow's bugling? 9 times out of 10, that's what you're hearing. It doesn't mean there isn't a bull in there bugling, but in most cases, if they could just get glass on them, they would see it's cows making that sound and just keeping their little groups tight-knit. So if you do that in a blind cold calling setup, once hunting season starts early on, because once they get a bull with them, you hardly ever hear that cow call again like that. He takes over, and now he's the man of the house, so to speak, and he does all the collecting and keeping everything tight. But early on, you can actually attract a lot of different elk and even small bulls by going with that little wimpy bugle, imitating cows with no bull. And so you see there's some method to the madness there.
Mm-hmm. So as you said earlier, it doesn't hit kind of that 3-point pitch or tone. It's just more consistent.
No, one tone.
Yeah.
I have video. You guys should email me, and I have video of cows bugling, and I could show you them what they sound like. But anyway, and that just kind of cements it. But yeah, anybody that hears this, if they say, "Hey, Paul, I would love to see those cows bugling," email me, and I'll be happy to send you a link where you can watch them bugle. And I mean, they sound just like a bull. It's really cool.
Yeah, that's very neat. Very neat for sure. So we've talked, early season. We just mentioned that calling specifically. We've talked a little bit about, kind of the blind calling and cold calling. And you mentioned specifically that that's not effective for calling in bigger bulls for sure. So what is your strategy, if we can, maybe for now, stick to early season if you're targeting a big bull? Is that something where you're just trying to locate him first and then make your move, and you're not relying on necessarily throwing out blind locator calls and things like that, but you really need to know, here's where the bull is, here's where I need to be, and now I can consider making a move?
Well, early season, it's really a crapshoot because the elk aren't talking a lot. And there's other, I know this is on calling and stuff, but to be quite honest, Come early season, we rely on quite a few different strategies. I mean, sitting water is great if you have an area where elk are using it, and you'll know because it'll smell like a barnyard. If you find water, even in heavily areas where there's water everywhere, and it's really hard to find out where are these elk watering because it's just available all over the place, is you actually have to find the spots that smell like a barnyard and it's just tore up. And so hunting those areas like that are great, even if it's mostly cows that are coming in, because what you have to appreciate, each day that goes by, a cow can come in heat at any time. So what you find is these bulls, every 2 or 3 days, will go to these destination spots or use the same trails that these cows are using. Why? They're scent checking them. They're smelling the ground, because when a cow starts coming into estrus, she'll start leaking 2-3 days before she's ever ready to be bred. And the oldest cows come in first. The cows that are in that 7-8 year old or older will start coming in toward the last week of August. And that's why a lot of times you'll hear guys talk, man, they were screaming everywhere September 1st. Other guys were 5 miles away and heard nothing. So right place, right time, you can actually have cows coming into heat. Well, these bulls are running these trails or these destination spots, bedding areas, feeding areas, water, wherever it is that these cows are going, and they'll work these trails, smelling them out. So a lot of times pre-season or pre-rut is we will actually look for these areas where the elk are feeding. We really don't care that much where they are bedding if they're not very vocal, is we just try to get on those trails they're using to and from, because they're using them daily. And eventually you can have a bull come sneaking right by there as his nose is to the ground. Get the wind right, sit on one of those trails. It's just another strategy. Now, if I happen to come across, and we have, it seems about every other year, we get into some really good bugling the first couple days of August. So if I get into bugling at that time, let's say I hear 2 bugles, 1 or 2 bugles early in the morning, okay, just after daylight, and I know that MO. I'm probably not going to hear anything. If I do, I'll hear them within the next 15, 20 minutes. But most of the time, that's it. That's all they'll do. That is a really killable bull right there. The biggest issue is guys don't know how to approach that, because maybe that bull bugled a half a mile away, and they're like, they go halfway and then they start cow calling, bugling, doing everything, and nothing. He won't say anything, but they know he's over there. So how do you kill that bull? How do you have the opportunity to kill that bull? Oh, I mean, this is how we kill them every year. I mean, this is what I'm trying to say. There's a strategy for those quiet times. I call those quiet times, even though you heard 1 or 2 bugles. All you have to do is go in and advertise yourself as a new bull in the area. No cow sounds. You have to remember that elk are herd animals. That bull you heard, he probably isn't very far away from at least a dozen other elk. There's just nothing in heat, nothing in estrus. So he's not excited, but he'll give that lazy bugle, feeling his oats. But what they do know, every elk in their area know each bull by their sound, sight, or smell. They got a pecking order down. So they know where they fall in the range of who's going to be a herd bull and who's not, which means if you're hunting an area with 25 bulls per 100 cows, how many herd bulls are going to be out of that 25? About a dozen to 15 bulls will be a herd bull, not 1 or 2. Because you can't take 2 bulls and cover 50 cows each. This doesn't happen. So when you really look at the dynamics of that, you'll see 1 bull has 3, 1 has 6, 1 has 4, 1 may have 10. So, and they all go to their little parts. So these bulls pre-rut, before they start collecting a bunch of cows, they need to know where each bull falls into that pecking order. So they need to size each other up. So when you come into a new area, and if you can get within 150, 200 yards of that bull, that's all you have to get so you don't bust him. Get the wind in your favor. Start advertising yourself like a real bull does as he enters a new area. They're called ridge runner bulls, and they'll move from area to area looking for hot cows. And in most cases, he will bugle nonstop for anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, nonstop. And he'll rake and thrash, but he's very creative. His bugling is not predictable. He's not giving you 3 notes and chuckle every time like a hunter. He's low. He's high. He's giving you a half a second bugle, groans, growls, and then he'll bugle high. And then he's just raking and he's thrashing. He's feeling. He'll do some pants. And they do a lot of stuff as they throw their sound out and they advertise, letting the elk in that area know there is a new bull to contend with. Now, what does that attract? All the cows?
No, it attracts the bull because he needs to know who you are. He listens to you and listens to you down there. And he's like, who the hell is that? That's not Joe or Peter or Frank or Scott. He doesn't know who he is. And so he eventually comes over. I've called as many as 6 bulls at one time, and they've never made one peep, coming all together in a bachelor group. Then I've called tons of 1s and 2s and 3s that come up, but they come in silent. When I say silent, I mean non-vocal, but you can hear them walking. They're crack, crack, pop, pop. I mean, they're coming right at you. They want to see who you are. And a lot of times as they start getting in that 50, 60-yard range, you'll hear them starting to rake. This is how a bull will introduce himself to a new bull in an area. He will start raking, and he wants you to do the same thing, and you size one another up. This is not for a fight. This is how they introduce themselves. Bulls rake for a lot of different reasons. That's just one of them. They rake for cows. They rake for challenges if that's the situation. You see, so you have to identify what each situation that you're in is requiring from the bull. The reason he's raking at that time is he's trying to draw you over to him. He wants to size you up, but he will eventually come right into you. And I tell you what, we call a lot of bulls in like that early season when they're trying to find out who that new kid on the block is. And once again, if that bull doesn't come, what have you heard? He's still there. You haven't busted anything out of the area. So it takes a while, though. If you think you're going to just give a few bugles and wait 4 or 5 minutes and they come wandering in, that's wonderful. But it really rarely happens. You have to rake, like I say, you're calling, you're bugling. And have you ever heard a bull do that?
Yeah.
They'll do it, boy. I'll tell you what. I mean, they'll go on, and you're like, what in the world? I mean, these are real elk that do it. You don't hear it every day. But the point is that when you get into that situation, if you think you're going to just cow call, and he comes running up, you know what happens 9 times out of 10? Cows and spikes show up first. Why? There's so many more of them. You got so many bulls and you got a ton of cows, so the odds are they show first, and they usually do. And so that's why when we're after bulls, we try to use sounds that attract bulls first. This doesn't mean a cow never shows up first, but the odds are really low for them to. And so we're trying to pull bulls over. And that's what we call an advertising sequence. It's used for the time frame when there's no rutting going on, but you're getting a bull to bugle here or there, or even a couple of little bugles. You'll be surprised how that will pull those bulls right into you to come and see who you are. And so that's just one of our tricks. We just use it now and then. It's not something you use all the time, but when the occasion arises, pre-rut, that is a perfect scenario to go to, and it will usually pull him right in.
And when you're doing that, are you sitting in one spot, or are you actually maybe running a ridge and moving and covering some ground to see if you can find them?
No, we don't move at all. We're in a tight a setup as we would if we were blind or cold calling. No movement whatsoever. You stay right there, unless you have an elk coming in. And you feel you need to reposition, obviously, because he's coming in from a different spot. And a lot of times when I'm doing that, I'll usually have like a big rock there. I love having a rock the size of a softball or baseball or a heavy stick in case they start coming in. And I know they're coming in where I don't want them to, so I'll cast that stone or that rock in to redirect them. And it does. If they hear that commotion over there, it's like, oh, they make a little U-turn and they can start going right to where they heard. And they're thinking, okay, that's where the elk is over there, you see. And so a lot of times you can redirect them without making any sound as far as an elk sound at all by just making a commotion over there. And a lot of times that's all it takes so you can get the shot. And this is good for a solo hunter, that because you don't have the option of a tag team guy behind you that might be able to maneuver that bull.
Well, that is a wrap on part 1. Again, be sure to tune back in soon, catch episode 37, part 2 with Paul, and get that second bonus keyword for the pack giveaway. And, of course, consider leaving us that review on iTunes or contacting us at podcast@exomountaingear.com. Again, next episode, another keyword, another chance to win. Come back soon.